The dust hung thick in the air, burned powder mixed with the metallic taste of blood, and for a moment the battlefield was nothing but noise, chaos, and confusion. Bullets snapped overhead like angry hornets, the rattle of machine guns echoing through the narrow valley, and the cries of the wounded cut through the static of comms chatter. In the middle of it all knelt one figure, his rifle slung behind him as he pressed gauze into the shredded leg of a Marine barely clinging to consciousness. His hands moved fast, precise, almost mechanical, and yet there was something fierce in the way he worked, as if failure was simply not an option. He wasn't just a medic patching up wounds, he was the difference between life and death. His name was Walker, and while everyone knew him as the combat medic attached to the SEAL team, what they didn't realize, at least not yet, was that he was far more than that. He tied off the tourniquet, checked the Marine's pulse, and shouted for extraction. The helicopter was minutes out, and minutes were everything in this kind of fight. With a final pat on the Marine's shoulder, Walker grabbed his rifle, rolled behind the rock outcrop, and his entire posture shifted. The calm urgency of a medic vanished, replaced by the coiled stillness of a predator about to strike. His breathing slowed, his eyes narrowed, and when he shouldered the rifle, it wasn't the M4 carbine most carried. It was a suppressed sniper system pulled from his pack, carefully wrapped and hidden until now. The SEAL nearest him glanced over and froze, as if not quite believing what he was seeing. Walker had always been the quiet one, the guy who saved lives in the background, never the one kicking indoors or calling the shots. Yet here he was, snapping the bipod open, glassing the ridgeline with the practiced ease of a man who had done this before, not just once but countless times. The wind whipped dust across his face, but he ignored it. On the opposite ridge, muzzle flashes flared from enemy positions pinning down the team. Without hesitation, Walker adjusted for range, exhaled, and squeezed. One shot, clean, surgical, the flash disappeared. The SEAL beside him blinked, then grinned in disbelief. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, ducking as another burst sprayed the rocks. Walker didn't answer. He was already shifting, reacquiring targets. Another enemy leaned out to fire, and again Walker's rifle cracked. Silence followed. 2 shots, 2 kills. It was the kind of precision that turned the tide of a firefight, and the SEALs around him began to realize this wasn't luck or desperation. It was skill, honed and deadly. Word spread across the comms, "Doc's a sniper." Some laughed, half joking, half in awe, but Walker tuned it all out. He wasn't here for recognition. He was here because his team needed someone to break the chokehold the enemy had on their position. He spotted another figure crawling behind a machine gun nest, calculated wind drift with a glance at the smoke trails in the valley, and fired again. The machine gun fell silent. By now, the Marines and SEALs alike were watching him work, caught between relief and astonishment. Moments ago, Walker had been elbow-deep in torn flesh, fighting to keep a man alive. Now he was methodically dismantling the enemy, one shot at a time, each kill saving a dozen of his brothers from certain death. It was as if 2 entirely different men existed in one body, the healer and the hunter, the man who gave life and the man who took it with equal precision. The helicopter thundered into view, its rotors chopping the smoky air, and Walker slung his rifle back, dragging the wounded Marine to the landing zone with the same strength and urgency he'd shown in the fight. He barked orders at 2 younger soldiers, his tone sharp but controlled, then heaved the Marine into the waiting bird. Only when the chopper lifted, dust spraying across the valley floor, did he allow himself a single breath of relief. The team regrouped behind the rocks, eyes wide, adrenaline pumping, and one of the SEALs clapped him on the shoulder, laughing despite the chaos. "You're not just a doc," he said, shaking his head. "You're a damn ghost." Walker didn't smile, didn't acknowledge it. His face was calm, unreadable, as though he'd simply done what needed to be done. Inside, though, there was a storm, memories clawing at the edge of his mind, old scars from another life that explained why he was so comfortable behind the scope. He had sworn that part of him was over, buried beneath the uniform of a medic, hidden behind the oath to save lives. But in war you don't get to choose which part of yourself the fight demands. He had been forced to pick up the rifle again, and now the secret was out. The SEALs couldn't believe what they had seen, and neither could he, because deep down he knew this wasn't the last time he would have to become both healer and executioner in the same breath. The valley was quieter now, but only on the surface. Beneath the smoke and scattered debris, the enemy was regrouping, shifting positions in the hills beyond. The SEAL team huddled together, weapons checked, ammo redistributed, each man's face smeared with grit and sweat. They were alive, but just barely, and many of them knew it was because of the medic they thought they understood but clearly did not. Walker crouched near the edge of the rocks, scanning the terrain with the same sharp intensity that had carried them through the firefight minutes earlier. His rifle rested across his knees, not quite put away, as though he anticipated the fight was far from finished. One of the team leaders, a broad-shouldered veteran named Rains, walked up, studying him with an expression that mixed suspicion and gratitude. "Doc," he said finally, his voice rough, "where the hell did you learn to shoot like that?" Walker didn't look at him. His eyes stayed on the ridgeline, watching for movement. "Wrong time for questions," he muttered. It wasn't defiance, more like a wall going up, and Rains knew better than to press. But the seed of curiosity had been planted, and it wouldn't go away. They moved out shortly after, weaving through the jagged rocks toward their next objective, a half-collapsed compound rumored to house enemy intel. The sun beat down harshly, baking their gear, and every man carried the fatigue of battle in his stride. Walker kept to the rear, the position of a medic, but his senses were alive in ways none of them noticed. He counted shadows against the rocks, watched the way the birds scattered from the higher cliffs, noted the faint glint of glass where a scope might catch the light. He didn't say anything until he had to. Then his hand shot up, signaling the team to halt. They froze instantly, trusting his instincts even if they didn't fully understand them. Slowly, Walker crouched, unslinging his rifle once more. The shift in his body language was subtle but unmistakable. The medic was gone and the sniper was back. He adjusted the scope, his breathing deep, steady, controlled. Through the magnified glass, the truth became clear. 3 figures on the ridge, camouflaged poorly but deadly enough, rifles trained on the path the team would have taken in less than a minute. One squeeze of the trigger and the first enemy fell without a sound. The second scrambled, confused, and Walker's bullet found him before he could fire. The third tried to retreat, but a single exhale later, the ridge was silent. Walker lowered his rifle, signaling all clear, and the team advanced, passing through the kill zone that would have ended them all. Not a word was spoken, but the glances thrown his way said more than questions ever could. When they reached the compound, the fight ignited again. Gunfire erupted from broken windows and shattered doorways, and the SEALs surged forward with controlled aggression, clearing room by room in brutal bursts of violence. Walker should have been behind them, tending to the wounded, but when one of the men was pinned by an enemy with a machine gun in an upper floor, it was Walker who knelt in the courtyard, scope trained upward, waiting for the fraction of a second when the gunner leaned too far out. One shot ended the standoff and the team pushed through. Minutes blurred into hours as they fought through the compound, until at last the smoke cleared and silence fell again. Walker moved from man to man, checking wounds, applying pressure dressings, starting IVs. His hands were steady, his voice calm, and for a moment he seemed like nothing more than the medic they had always known. But in the eyes of those who had watched him switch roles without hesitation, he was something else entirely now. That night, as they camped in the shelter of the compound, Rains sat across from him, the firelight flickering between them. The others were asleep or on watch, but Rains wasn't letting this go. "You've done this before?" he said quietly. Walker didn't respond, just kept cleaning his rifle with mechanical precision. "You don't shoot like that unless you were trained for it. That's not luck. That's not just being good with a weapon. That's years of work." Finally, Walker looked up, his eyes shadowed and hard. "Does it matter?" he asked. Rains leaned forward. "Yeah, it matters. Because I need to know who's watching my back." Walker considered him for a long moment, then went back to his rifle. "I'm your medic. That's all you need to know." But Rains wasn't convinced, and neither was anyone else. They had seen the truth in action, and once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. The man who had saved their lives with bandages and morphine was the same man who had saved their lives with bullets from half a mile away, and that combination was something they had never expected. In the silence of the night, Walker sat alone, listening to the distant echoes of war across the valley. He knew the questions would keep coming, but the answers weren't simple. Once, long ago, he had been exactly what they suspected. A sniper, one of the best. But he had buried that part of himself, or at least tried to. Now, the battlefield had dragged it back into the light, and there was no putting it away again. The next morning the air was sharp and cold, the kind of chill that crept under armor and made every movement heavier. Dawn stretched pale light across the mountains as the team prepared to move out, packs tightened, weapons checked, radios crackling with terse updates. Walker moved quietly among them, checking supplies, inspecting the wounded, changing dressings, and adjusting 4 lines for those stable enough to continue. He was efficient, professional, exactly what they expected from a medic. But no one looked at him the same way anymore. Every time he touched a bandage or spoke calmly to a soldier clenching his teeth against pain, they remembered the stillness in his eyes behind the scope, the way he had ended enemies before they had even realized they were targets. He carried both faces without hesitation, but it unsettled them all the same. As they moved deeper into the mountains, the terrain grew harsher, jagged rocks cutting at their boots, narrow paths winding along cliffs that dropped hundreds of feet into empty valleys. The radios buzzed with reports of enemy patrols nearby, and tension thickened in the ranks. Rains took point, but it was Walker who noticed the patterns again. The unnatural quiet, the missing goat herds and villages they passed, the way the birds had gone silent in the trees. He felt it before it happened, that prickle at the back of the neck every soldier learned to trust. He raised a hand, halting the column, his gaze sweeping across the ridge. Then came the crack of a rifle, the sharp whistle of a round tearing the air, and chaos exploded. The enemy had set an ambush, fighters pouring gunfire from the cliffs above. The SEALs dove for cover, returning fire in bursts, but they were pinned against the rocks with little room to maneuver. Walker dropped low, dragging a bleeding man behind cover, pressing quick dressings against the wound, then without a pause he unslung his rifle and crawled to a vantage point. The transition was seamless, terrifyingly fast, as if he were two men trading places in the same body. Through the scope he picked out the shooter who had fired the first shot, hidden behind jagged stone, and with a calm exhale ended him. Another muzzle flash, another precise crack, another body slumping out of sight. The SEALs laid down suppressing fire, but it was Walker who broke the ambush, dismantling the enemy positions one by one with cold accuracy. By the time the last echoes of gunfire faded, the survivors of the ambush were retreating into the hills, leaving their dead behind. The SEALs were breathing hard, adrenaline shaking their limbs, but they were alive. Again it was Walker who had made the difference. He immediately went back to the wounded, hands slick with blood as he worked under fire, calling for morphine, ordering others to hold pressure, his voice steady even as sweat ran down his face. 2 men had serious wounds and he kept them alive long enough for evacuation, his focus absolute. When the medevac bird finally thundered in and whisked them away, the silence that followed felt heavier than the gunfire had. The team sat scattered among the rocks, catching their breath, stealing glances at Walker. He was cleaning his rifle again, calm, methodical, as if nothing about what had just happened was extraordinary. But to them it was. They had fought beside snipers before, seen their work, respected their skill. But never had they seen a man switch from life-saving medic to death-dealing marksman in the span of heartbeats, and it shook something deep inside them. That night they bivouacked on a plateau overlooking the valley, the stars harsh and brilliant above them. Rains finally broke the silence, his voice low but carrying in the still air. "You can't hide it anymore, document. They all saw it. Hell, I saw it. You're not just a medic. You've got training most guys never even touch. So what's the story?" Walker sat apart, his back against a boulder, rifle across his knees. He didn't look up. "The story is that I keep you alive. That's all." Rains pressed. "No, that's not all. You don't just keep us alive with bandages and shots. You keep us alive with that rifle. I've seen a lot of shooters but none like you. You were made for it." Walker's jaw tightened, his silence stretching long enough that the others thought he might never answer. Finally he spoke, his voice flat, controlled, but carrying a weight none of them had heard before. "I was a sniper once. Before I was a medic. I was good at it, too good. I killed more men than I can count. Every shot was clean, every mission a success, but it ate at me piece by piece until I wasn't sure there was anything human left. I left it behind. I swore I'd never pick up that role again. Becoming a medic was the only way I could live with myself, trading death for life." The fire crackled, the only sound. In the silence that followed, none of them knew what to say. They had wanted answers, but the weight of his truth left them uneasy. Rains finally nodded slowly. "Well," he said, "whatever you were, whatever you think you left behind, it's still in you. And I'm glad it is. Because without both sides of you, we wouldn't be here right now." Walker didn't reply. He stared into the fire, lost in memories only he could see, and wondered how much longer he could walk the line between healer and killer before one side consumed the other completely. The days that followed bled into each other, a rhythm of marching through hostile valleys, firefights that flared up like sudden storms, and nights spent under a sky too vast and cold to offer any comfort. The mission was clear: push deeper into enemy territory, disrupt supply lines and recover intelligence from hidden caches. But the path was soaked in danger. The SEALs were hardened men, veterans of countless battles, yet even they began to rely on the quiet figure who never faltered, whether he was binding wounds with steady hands or dropping enemies with unerring precision. Walker carried the weight of both roles as if they were his destiny, though inside the strain grew heavier. He had become the spine of the unit, the one constant presence when chaos threatened to break them apart. Each morning he checked their gear, replaced bandages, and muttered reminders about hydration and meds, and each afternoon when ambushes struck he was the ghost behind the scope, delivering death with frightening calm. The duality disturbed them, but it also comforted them, because they knew that no matter what came, Walker would find a way to keep them breathing. One evening, after a brutal skirmish that left 3 enemies dead and 1 SEAL badly wounded, the team huddled inside an abandoned hut, the smell of cordite still clinging to their uniforms. Walker worked for nearly an hour on the injured man, stitching torn flesh by the flicker of a flashlight, his movement steady despite the fatigue pulling at his limbs. When he finally leaned back, satisfied the soldier would live, Rains crouched beside him. "You ever think about what it does to you?" he asked softly. Walker didn't look up. What does?" Rains studied him, his face lined with grime and exhaustion. "Carrying both sides. Saving one man, killing another. Switching like it's nothing. Doesn't it tear you apart?" Walker tied off the final stitch, wiped blood from his gloves, and only then answered. "It tears me apart every second. But that's the job. You don't get to pick the pieces you carry. You just carry them until you can't anymore." Rains said nothing, but his respect deepened. The others pretended to sleep, though most of them had been listening, their unease growing into something closer to reverence. They had seen men break under less, but Walker bore it all in silence, his burden invisible except in the flatness of his voice when he spoke of it. The next day, as they advanced toward a mountain pass, the enemy struck harder than before. Mortars rained from the ridges, the ground erupting in plumes of dirt and fire, while gunfire cascaded from every angle. The SEALs dove for cover, returning fire where they could, but they were outnumbered and pinned. Walker dragged 2 wounded men to a shallow ditch, throwing himself over them as shrapnel tore through the air. Then he rose and scathed, his rifle already in hand. Through the smoke and chaos, he found targets as if the world had slowed for him alone. Each squeeze of the trigger carved space for the team to maneuver, each kill pulling them back from the edge of annihilation. Rains shouted orders, men scrambled to flank, but it was Walker who anchored them, the calm center in the storm. When at last the mortars ceased and the surviving enemy fled into the mountains, the team emerged battered but alive. 3 were wounded, 1 critically, and Walker went straight to work, his hands red again, his voice steady as he fought to hold life inside a body eager to give it up. Hours later, when the evacuation bird roared overhead and lifted the injured away, the SEALs sat in exhausted silence. They watched Walker clean his rifle by lantern light, and for the first time no one questioned the contradiction he embodied. They accepted it, even depended on it, because without it they would already be dead. That night, Rains approached him again, not with suspicion this time but with quiet gratitude. "You saved us all back there," he said simply. Walker shook his head. "We saved each other. That's how it works." But Rains wasn't convinced. "Not like you. You're something else." Walker looked away, his eyes distant. "Something else is what I've been running from." The words hung heavy in the cold night air. For a long time neither man spoke. Then Rains placed a hand on his shoulder, firm and steady. "Whatever you're running from, it's keeping us alive. And I don't care what it costs as long as you keep doing it." Walker didn't answer, but in his silence lay the truth he could never admit aloud. Every life he saved balanced against every life he ended, and one day the scales would tip too far to bear. Until then he would carry both sides because there was no other choice. The mountain pass loomed ahead like a jagged scar in the earth, cliffs rising sheer on both sides, the path no wider than a convoy truck and littered with the wreckage of battles fought long before. The team moved cautiously, nerves strung tight, weapons angled toward the heights. Everyone knew it was a perfect place for an ambush, and the silence was too heavy, too deliberate. Walker kept to the rear again, his eyes never resting on one place for long. He studied the ridgelines, the shadows between rocks, the faint disturbances in the dust along the path. His instincts screamed, and when instincts screamed they were rarely wrong. He slowed his pace, raising his hand to signal a halt, but before the motion was complete the world exploded. Machine guns chattered from hidden nests, RPGs streaked from above, and the pass became a killing ground. The SEALs scattered, diving behind whatever cover they could find as dirt and shrapnel erupted around them. Walker was already moving, dragging a wounded man behind a boulder, pressing a bandage against the gaping wound with one hand while his other reached for his rifle. His transition was seamless again, as if his body understood the dual demands of the moment. He barked at another SEAL to hold pressure, then rolled to the edge of cover, scope rising to his eye. The enemy was dug in tight, overlapping fields of fire, making escape nearly impossible, but Walker's calm gaze cut through the chaos. One shot, then another, and one of the machine guns fell silent. He shifted, adjusted, fired again. A rocket operator slumped forward before he could reload. The SEALs took advantage, pushing forward in bursts, but every gain was bought by Walker's precision. His rifle cracked again and again, and with each shot the ambush began to unravel. Still, the enemy was relentless, and the pass echoed with screams and gunfire. One SEAL was hit in the chest, armor cracked, gasping for breath. Walker slid beside him, ripping open the plate carrier, his hands moving faster than thought as he sealed the wound and jammed a needle into the man's chest to release the pressure. The soldier gasped, life clawing its way back into him, and Walker shoved him toward two others to drag out of the kill zone. Then he was back on the scope, eyes cold, hands steady as if the weight of life and death balanced perfectly in his grip. Minutes stretched into hours, though in truth the fight burned itself out in less than 20. The ridges grew quiet, the last of the enemy retreating into the mountains, leaving their dead behind. Smoke hung thick in the air, and the team gathered in the shattered pass, battered, bruised, but alive. They looked to Walker not with suspicion now, not even with awe, but with something deeper, dependence. They knew that without him none of them would have walked out. Rains stood in the center of the road, chest heaving, rifle hanging loose in his grip, and he stared at Walker like a man seeing something he didn't quite believe. "That wasn't just saving us," he said hoarsely. "That was commanding the fight. You broke them apart, one shot at a time." Walker shook his head. "I did what I had to." Rains stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You're not just a medic. You're not just a sniper. You're both, and I don't know if that makes you a miracle or a curse, but right now you're the only reason this team's still breathing." Walker didn't answer. He turned back to the wounded, setting bones, stitching gashes, his face blank as though the firefight hadn't just happened. But inside he felt the truth pressing harder. Each time he picked up the rifle, it became easier, smoother, more natural, and he feared the medic inside him would one day disappear beneath the sniper's cold certainty. That night, as they camped in the ruins of an old watchtower, the men whispered among themselves. Some called him a savior, others a ghost, but all agreed on one thing. Walker wasn't like anyone they had ever known. He sat apart again, rifle resting across his knees, his eyes on the horizon where the enemy would surely rise again. Rains finally joined him, lowering himself onto the stone beside him. For a long time neither spoke. Then Rains said quietly, "When this mission's over you're going to have to choose. You can't keep carrying both sides forever." Walker's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away from the dark horizon. "I don't get to choose," he said softly. "The battlefield chooses for me." And in the silence that followed, Rains understood that whatever Walker had been running from, it was no longer in the past. It was here with them, shaping every step of their fight. The mission dragged them higher into the mountains, each mile harsher than the last, snow beginning to cling to the jagged stone, the thin air burning their lungs with every breath. Supplies ran low, fatigue clawed at their muscles, and the constant threat of ambush pressed down like a weight none of them could shake. Still they pushed forward, because orders demanded it and because men like Rains would never stop until the job was done. Walker marched silently among them, his pack heavy with medical gear, his rifle never far from reach. To the others he had become something unshakable, the man who patched their wounds in the dark and dropped enemies in the daylight, the presence they looked to when their own resolve faltered. Yet inside he felt the slow unraveling, each kill stirring the memories he had tried so long to bury. The cold mountain air did nothing to numb it. On the fourth day of climbing, they stumbled across an abandoned outpost, little more than stone walls and rusted equipment, but it offered shelter from the biting wind. They moved inside cautiously, checking corners, rifles raised, until they were certain it was clear. Walker set to work immediately, distributing what little food they had left, checking the feet of men blistered from the climb, cutting away dead skin and taping torn flesh. His hands were steady, his voice calm, and for a moment he looked only like the medic they had always known. But the illusion shattered with the sound of distant engines echoing through the valley. The team scrambled to positions, scanning the ridges, and Walker joined them, glassing the horizon through his scope. What he saw made his gut tighten. A convoy of enemy trucks crawled along the switchbacks, armored vehicles bristling with weapons, far more men than the SEALs could handle in a straight fight. Rains cursed under his breath, weighing options, but before he could give the order to retreat, Walker spoke. "We can't outrun them. Best chance is to hit them before they reach the pass." The others stared at him, surprised at the firmness in his tone. Medics didn't suggest offensive action, but Walker wasn't thinking like a medic. He was thinking like the sniper he had sworn he would never be again. Without waiting for permission, he slipped out of the outpost and climbed higher up the rocks, finding a vantage point overlooking the road. The wind cut sharp across his face, snow crunching under his boots, but his focus was absolute. He set up his rifle, adjusted for distance and angle, and waited. When the lead truck rounded the bend, he exhaled and fired. The driver slumped, the vehicle veering off the road and tumbling down the cliff in a roar of twisting metal. Panic rippled through the convoy. Walker worked methodically, disabling the armored vehicles first, then targeting the officers who barked orders. Each shot threw the enemy into deeper chaos, giving the SEALs the chance to strike from the outpost with controlled bursts of fire. The valley became a killing ground, not for the SEALs but for the enemy trapped on the narrow road with no room to maneuver. In less than 20 minutes the convoy was destroyed, burning wrecks littering the mountainside, survivors scattering into the snow. The SEALs regrouped, breathless, staring at the carnage below with disbelief. They had been outnumbered 5-1, yet they stood untouched, and the reason sat above them, calm behind his scope. When Walker descended from the ridge, no one spoke at first. They only watched him, a mix of awe and unease on their faces. Finally Rains broke the silence. "You planned that," he said slowly. "You didn't just react. You saw it and you decided how it would end." Walker met his eyes, his own expression unreadable. "I did what needed to be done." The others exchanged glances, whispers running through them. Some saw him as a savior, others as something unnatural, but all knew the truth. They had crossed a line. Their medic wasn't just a backup shooter anymore. He was the one steering the fight, shaping it with every squeeze of the trigger. That night, in the hollow silence of the outpost, Walker sat apart again, staring at the flames of their small fire. His hands were steady as he cleaned his rifle, but inside he felt the weight pressing harder than ever. Rains joined him, settling onto the cold stone. "You can't keep pretending this is just circumstance," he said quietly. "This is who you are." Walker shook his head. "It's who I was. I swore I'd never go back." "Then why are you doing it now?" Walker didn't answer immediately. He stared into the fire, the crackle of burning wood filling the silence. At last he said, "Because you'd all be dead if I didn't." Rains nodded slowly, accepting the truth but not the cost. "Maybe so. But how many times can you carry both sides before one breaks you?" Walker said nothing, but in the shadows of the mountains, he knew the answer was already closing in. The following morning broke with an uneasy calm. The HOA board, after their humiliating defeat in court and the public outrage that followed, had gone quiet. But everyone in the neighborhood knew it was the silence of wolves licking their wounds, waiting for a chance to strike again. Karen in particular was restless. She could not bear the shame of being called out, and she despised the fact that her authority was slipping away. Yet while she plotted in the shadows, I focused on something different. I was determined to rebuild the sense of peace in my home and my business by the lake. The local media had already shifted their attention to news stories, but within the neighborhood, people continued to talk about what had happened. Some were proud of me for standing firm, while others whispered that I had humiliated the HOA too severely. I didn't mind the whispers. I had fought for what was right, and I wasn't about to apologize for it. The lakefront cafe was thriving more than ever. New customers showed up daily, some just curious to meet the person who had defeated Karen and her HOA army. Many became regulars. My staff, who had stood beside me through the chaos, now worked with smiles, no longer fearing HOA interference. The once constant harassment had vanished like smoke after fire. Yet I knew Karen too well, she would not stay quiet for long. One evening as I locked up the cafe, I noticed her car parked across the street. She wasn't even trying to hide. She sat inside, glaring, her arms folded tightly across her chest, her face twisted with resentment. She wanted me to see her. To know that in her mind this wasn't over. But this time I felt no fear. I gave her a calm nod as though acknowledging a defeated rival and walked away. My confidence only seemed to enrage her more. Days later she called for a secret HOA meeting. I didn't attend of course, but neighbors who disliked her told me what was said. She had ranted for nearly an hour about how outsiders were ruining the neighborhood and how rules must be restored. But the board members, exhausted from their recent public shaming, were no longer eager to fight. Only a few of her closest allies still supported her, and even they looked nervous. Her grip on power was crumbling. Despite that, Karen tried one last desperate move. She filed a complaint with the county about supposed environmental violations at my cafe, claiming my use of the lake was damaging natural resources. Inspectors were sent, but they quickly discovered the truth. I had gone out of my way to follow environmental guidelines. In fact, I had recently invested in eco-friendly systems to ensure the cafe not only complied with regulations but set a higher standard for the whole town. The inspectors left with compliments, and Karen was once again exposed for her lies. The news spread fast, and this time even her loyalists turned against her. The county sent her a warning for filing false complaints, and her reputation shattered completely. Her downfall was almost painful to watch. She who once strutted through the neighborhood barking orders now walked with her head lowered, avoided by everyone. Children whispered about the crazy lake lady, and neighbors refused to meet her eyes. For the first time, Karen was powerless. Yet I didn't rejoice in her ruin. Instead, I felt a strange mix of pity and relief. She had built her whole identity on control, and without it, she seemed lost. I, on the other hand, had gained everything I needed: peace, respect, and freedom. The HOA still technically existed, but it was little more than a formality. Its members rarely met, and when they did, it was to discuss small matters like gardening schedules or community picnics. No one dared to interfere with me again. My cafe by the lake became a place of laughter and comfort, a symbol of resilience in the face of tyranny. Customers came not just for coffee or pastries but for the story, the reminder that standing firm against bullies could bring real change. As summer drew closer, the lake sparkled with sunlight, and the air filled with the hum of families enjoying the water. Looking at the scene one evening, I realized the fight had never been about property rights or lake access alone. It had been about freedom, about the right to live without constant fear of someone abusing power. And in that battle we had won. Karen's shadow had finally lifted, and for the first time since moving in, I felt truly at home. The tension reached its breaking point when Karen and her supporters called for an emergency HOA meeting. She announced it with a smug grin, thinking this would be the day she finally regained her authority over the community. But what she didn't know was that we had been preparing for this moment for weeks. My son, who had already proven his genius with technology, had created a livestream setup that would broadcast the entire meeting online for all residents to watch, ensuring complete transparency. We knew Karen thrived in closed rooms where she could intimidate, manipulate, and twist the rules. But with everything recorded in public, her tricks would backfire. As neighbors filed into the community hall, the atmosphere was electric. Half were there to support me, tired of Karen's bullying, and the other half were either fearful or blindly loyal to her reign. Karen strutted in as if she were a queen, her binder full of fabricated evidence against me. She cleared her throat loudly, demanding silence, and began reading a long list of so-called violations. She accused me of breaking HOA laws, endangering the peace of the neighborhood, and even claimed my family was a security threat. The absurdity of her accusations would have been laughable if not for the malice behind them. When she finished, she turned to the crowd with a smug look, expecting applause and agreement. But before anyone could react, my son stepped forward. Calm and confident, he connected his laptop to the projector, and the giant screen flickered to life. Before we proceed, he said, "Let's look at the facts." With a few clicks, he pulled up video evidence of Karen trespassing on our property multiple times, yelling threats, and even attempting to disconnect our internet cables. Gasps filled the room as the footage played. Karen's face turned red and she began to shout, "This is fake. Manipulated. Don't believe this." But my son anticipated her denial. He pulled up timestamps, server logs, and even showed the live security feed of her standing near our property gate just a few days earlier. There was no escape. Her own actions had betrayed her. The crowd that once feared her was now whispering in outrage, turning against her with every passing second. But we weren't done. I stood up and produced documents I had been keeping safe: legal papers, city records, and most importantly, a cease and desist order that we had filed against the HOA for harassment. The audience grew silent as I explained how Karen had overstepped her authority, how she had tried to enforce HOA rules on a property that was legally outside their jurisdiction, and how her actions not only violated community trust but also state laws. Then came the final blow. My son displayed the HOA's own bylaws on the projector and highlighted a clause: any board member found guilty of harassment, misuse of funds, or falsifying information would be immediately removed from their position. We had proof that Karen had done all three. The silence in the hall turned heavy. Karen's face was pale now, her arrogance drained. For the first time she seemed small, cornered, and powerless. She tried one last desperate attempt to rally her supporters, screaming, "They're lying. You all know me. I've protected this community. But no one clapped, no one cheered. Instead, murmurs of enough is enough, and she's gone too far spread through the crowd. Finally, one of the other board members stood up and declared, "Karen, you're removed. Effective immediately." The words hung in the air like thunder. Karen's eyes widened in shock, and she began shouting incoherently, threatening lawsuits, and pointing at me as if I were the villain. But no one listened anymore. Security was called, and she was escorted out of the building while the residents watched silently. Some even sighed in relief. For the first time in years, the neighborhood was free from her iron grip. When the meeting ended, people gathered around us, thanking me and my son. They admitted they had been afraid to speak up against Karen, but seeing her lies exposed gave them courage. Unity returned to the community and a new board was elected, one that actually cared about fairness and peace. Life slowly returned to normal, but it was better than before. Neighbors who once avoided each other out of fear of Karen's gossip now laughed together at block parties. Rules were followed but not abused. And most importantly, my family could finally live without constant harassment. One evening, as my son and I sat on the porch watching the sunset over the quiet street, he turned to me and said, "You know, Mom, sometimes the best way to fight bullies is to give them the stage they crave, because when everyone's watching they show their true selves." I smiled, proud beyond words, and realized he was right. Karen had built her empire on fear and secrecy, but once her actions were exposed to the light, it crumbled. And though she had screamed, fought, and threatened until the end, in the end she was just a powerless voice fading into the background. The HOA war had ended, not with violence but with truth. And truth, in the end, was the greatest weapon of all. The end.